guys, as you see in the title. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Really nice to be here. I'm going to talk about a few different topics today. I'm hoping that because it's such a broad audience that I can share a few different things, and hopefully you'll have some questions. I'm also happy to just go as far as we get and then stop so there's enough time for questions. Yeah, so as Efrat was nicely introducing me, I'm an associate professor. I'm visiting the Technion. It's sadly almost over. I'm leaving at the end of this month. And I got my PhD at the University of Washington. And before that, I got my first 2 engineering degrees in Canada at the University of Western Ontario. You can see all the universities there. A little bit more about me. So I am a physical hydrologist. There's my research group. And we are very much interested in climate change, land cover change, impacts on water resources. And I've been serving as the director of the Western Water Assessment, which deals with, we connect with stakeholders like farmers, like reservoir managers, and we try to give them, we try to interpret climate information for them because they often don't have the capacity to work with that information. And I've been involved with a few community efforts like the United States National Climate Assessment, and I led something called the CMIP6 Task Force, which some of you may know what that stands for. It's basically the collection of future climate change models from around the world. So today I'm going to present 3 water-related research topics for you. And the first 2 deal with extremes in terms of flooding and excess water. So the first one is dealing with flooding, and if we can use knowledge of antecedent precipitation to understand how severe flooding will be. The second looks at a hazard related to flooding, which is landslides. And we were interested in the relationship between whether or not there had been a fire, a wildfire, or not, on the likelihood of flooding. And again, we're using precipitation to quantify the impact of fires. And the last topic is kind of shifting all the way over to the topic of drought and whether drought is going to become harder to predict under future climate. So I'm not sure how you like to do it in terms of people asking questions during or waiting till the end. So however you usually do things is fine with me. Okay, so the first topic, this is actually a short presentation that I gave 2 weeks ago at the EGU meeting in Vienna. And one of my co-authors here, Alex Fogman, is my sponsor at the Technion. And I just wanted to draw attention to that. So this is trying to understand the role of precipitation intermittency on flooding as a modulator of flooding. Okay, so flooding is a hazard, and I think this is fairly uncontroversial, that flooding is a hazard. What we have generally the general consensus is that heavy rainfall is regarded as the main driver of flooding. Okay. There have been historical increases in heavy rainfall in some parts of the world, and there are future projections of increasing extreme precipitation. So this raises the question of how significant are the risks of future flood? Okay, so looking into this a little bit further, it turns out that actually heavy rainfall is not as explanatory for flooding as we expected. And I'm showing a summary from a paper here from 2015, where the authors looked at over 400 river basins in the United States, and they used gridded precipitation and simulated discharge. And what they found was they were looking at what is the probability, given extreme rainfall, precipitation in the 99th percentile, what is the probability that that produces extreme flooding? And they found that this is much less than unity. Okay, only 36% of the cases. And so They also looked at simulated soil moisture and came and realized that a wet catchment, a wet watershed or river basin, is much more likely to produce flooding than a dry one. So 62% of the cases of wet catchments before the flood event produced flooding as it compared to 13%. So as a hydrologist, this is not particularly surprising, and we've sort of known this for a long time, that soil moisture can act to condition or to modulate flooding. It's actually, I think, somewhat surprising at how strong of a modulator it is. And there's been a couple other papers that have, like one in Australia, for example, that has looked at this as well. So one thing to keep in mind is that this study was done with gridded precipitation and simulated discharge from a model. And that means that the precipitation is very much representative of the discharge and the precipitation are very much connected. Okay, so fine. Soil moisture conditions flooding. So this raises the question of, well, what causes soil moisture to be dry in the first place? What might lead to a flood event not being so extreme because of dry soils? So the first general category of reasons is, you could have long-term drying, either through climate warming or elevated vapor pressure deficit that could result, or drought conditions. These are all reasons that you may have dry soils. The second reason that operates at a much shorter time scale is this concept of precipitation intermittency, which is sometimes called interstorm arrival time or the dry spell length. And what I'm showing down here is sort of how you can think about this. Here is soil moisture plotted on the vertical axis here. And then I've got a model, which is in red, a hydrology model, and a satellite, the SMAP, NASA's SMAP satellite in blue, and then a soil moisture probe is the X. And you can see on the top axis is precipitation. When you have a sufficiently large precipitation event, the soil moisture rises and then it decays, almost following an exponential decay, right? And so it decays fast and then slow, and that's because of the physics of the soil. And this E-folding drying timescale has been estimated to be somewhere between 5 and 20 days across planet Earth. This was done with a satellite, with the SMAP satellite. Observations suggest that that time actually might be a little bit slower than 5 to 20 days because the satellite only senses a shallow depth. And so obviously the deeper you go, the slower things change. Okay, so in this work, we wanted to look at the role of precipitation intermittency leading up to flood events, and how much can it tell us about whether or not you'd have a large flood or not. So we looked at two different definitions, very, very simple ones. One is just the time since the last rainfall, and the other is essentially the relative frequency of the rainfall leading up to the flood. And I want to distinguish a couple of things that we have a storm associated with the flood, a big storm. We're calling that the flood storm. And then in, say, the 30 days leading up to the flood itself, we have this intermittency that we're also paying attention to. So those are two different things. And we also considered a kind of a minimum threshold for precipitation in order for us to be counting it in this intermittency. As you can see, for example, there's a lot of these small events that don't really change the soil moisture much, and we think they're probably just not worth considering in this context. Okay, so what we did was we found 128 minimally regulated study basins. So these are places that don't have big reservoirs upstream, and they haven't had a lot of land cover change, meaning that we are generally confident that the discharge represents what's happening in the catchment, And so we needed at least 50 years of daily observed and simulated stream flow and precipitation. And so the stations are shown here. They're colored based on how many years of data we have. I made a histogram here of the length of record. So you have at least 50 years. In some cases, you have more than 100 years of data. And so we use that, and we use this automated flood and flood storm identification to pick out those events. And then we computed percentiles of both of those, the flood storm and the flood peak. And we did this analysis 2 different ways. The first way was using just gauge-based observations. So of precipitation, we have thus far only been using 1 precipitation gauge in each basin so that we have a long enough record. And we then repeated it, kind of like that previous study I was showing, using gridded precipitation and simulated discharge to see how those 2 things would compare. Okay, so what have we found so far? So if we consider the extreme or the magnitude of peak flow, flood peak, in the context of the magnitude of the storm, the large flood storm, and we convert those into percentile space, so percentiles of each, we use this term lambda to show the relative flood peak percentile, okay? And then the horizontal here is just the days since the last precipitation event. So this is one of the measures of intermittency. And what you can see is as you have more and more days since the last precipitation event, the magnitude of the flood tends to decrease. And this is a ratio here anyways. And the color, the blue, the cooler colors here show the percentile of the precipitation, the flood storm, and those tend to be lower percentiles versus red. And what this tells us is that if it hasn't been very long since your last storm, meaning the soils are pretty wet, then you can really have almost a larger range of storms can produce a flood. But as you get out to 10, 15, 20 days since the last rain event, it's really only the largest precipitation events that are producing floods. So that kind of confirms what we thought might happen. But there's a few different ways to look at this. So another way to look at it is now, if we, instead of the previous metric, we look at the number of dry days preceding the flood. This is a 30-day window. And we show that in the color here, and we're comparing the peak flow as a magnitude. And these are kind of crazy units. In the United States, there's cubic feet per second is a unit. And so that's what's shown here. What you see is in the first few days, you tend to have very noisy behavior, and that's because there's just a very small sample size of cases when there's only been 2, 3, or 4 dry days in a 30-day stretch. But once you get to a larger sample size, you tend to see the decline in peak flow with the number of dry days. However, there seems to be a bias towards large flows because if we now present this as a flow percentile, it's much less clear what's going on. And that the observations, I think there's a lot of uncertainty here, and it's not necessarily obvious that the magnitudes are decreasing. So this is pointing to some observational uncertainty that we are considering. The last way I'm going to show this may work is kind of repeating the structure of that paper that I shared with you at the beginning. So what is the probability, given an extreme precipitation event, what's the probability that you'll have an extreme flood event? Q99 given P99. And if we do this with models, like what was done in that paper, you actually see the behavior that you'd expect. The probability decreases with the days since your last precipitation event. Okay, so that's good. But if you use observations, stations, you really don't see any change, and if anything, you might even see an increasing probability, which doesn't make much sense and kind of speaks to this idea that we're seeing that using a single station to observe an entire watershed, I think, is somewhat problematic at missing storm events. This also combines all 128 basins together, all seasons, all land cover. So I welcome any ideas on why this may be happening, since this is still somewhat new work. So on this topic, the key points are basically presenting intermittency as an indirect measure of antecedent moisture, showing that intermittency can be a potential modulator of flood potential in some cases, not in all cases. And so there's still more work to figure out exactly why. And yes, there are considerable uncertainties. A number of things I didn't mention is that some of the percentiles and so on were calculated combining 1, 2, and 3 day flood storms. So those have different statistics, and for now we've just been combining those. With that, I'm going to move to the second topic, if that is okay. Okay. So this second topic shifts gears a little bit from flooding as a standalone event to flooding as part of this cascading hazard of a post-wildfire landslide. This is work that was recently published in the journal IES after a very long, lengthy review process. Okay, so landslides. As everybody probably appreciates, these are very destructive events, not just to property, but also to people, and potentially fatally so. And so it's clearly an important type of hazard to understand well. We think about these landslide events in the context of rarely being standalone events. What that means is you typically need a combination of susceptibility, okay, and a trigger. So imagine a situation where you've had a wildfire or a fire or some kind of event like that. You will not have a landslide unless you have a trigger, and in this case a trigger would be a storm, right? So if you don't have susceptibility or you don't have a trigger, there will be no landslide. The question is, what is the contribution of fires to landslides themselves? And so we're thinking about these events as being triggered as part of a sequence of a cascading natural hazard. And in particular, in this work, we were interested in the post-wildfire landslide. Okay, so imagine a wildfire happens, then you have extreme rainfall, then you have a landslide. And so what is the contribution, we were wondering, about the wildfire component? So while we were working on this, in Colorado, in one of our main highways, Interstate 70, near kind of near Vail, if anybody's heard of that, kind of near Aspen in Colorado, the main highway got closed because there was a landslide. And really what's interesting is if you read the news, they say that after rain over an area burned by a wildfire, once again triggered mudslides. So there's kind of this knowledge in the public, in the community, that this is a problem. But what has been lacking, I think, is a large-scale quantification of whether this is actually the case and to what extent we can statistically show that it is the case. So the hypothesis that we're testing is that wildfire increases landslide susceptibility by increasing runoff and sediment transport. So you can have, we've had many very large fires in the western United States, especially in the past 4 or 5 years. And what you typically get is destroyed vegetation and decreases in organic matter at the surface. Both of those tend to increase runoff and increase sediment transport. It's actually controversial as to whether that makes the soil hydrophobic and makes more likely to repel water and increase runoff. There's research that suggests that actually fires make the surface more like kind of like a sponge that can, an ash can absorb a lot of water. Nevertheless, there tend to be two ways that you can get a landslide, okay? And we can think of these as two endpoints. On one hand, you can have runoff-driven landslides, which are typically an intense storm event, and you get hill slope erosion from many different locations that come together in a confluence that produces a debris flow, okay? It's distributed in origin and then it comes together. The other way is an infiltration-driven landslide where you have a long period of rainfall and then the water pressure in the soil rises slowly, and then you may have an entire slope failure like is shown here. And it seems that the most common by quite a lot in post-wildfire landslides is the runoff-driven landslide. And so that's the one we're focusing on today. Okay, so the main gap that this work addresses is that we are looking at regional comparisons of landslides at both burned locations, places that have had a fire, and unburned locations, places that have not had a fire recently. And this is a gap because most studies have either looked at just a few sites, okay, or they've looked at a lot of sites but only looking at places that have been burned. And so we are basically going to compare landslide triggering precipitation between post-wildfire and unburned locations across multiple global regions. Okay, so what does this look like? So we ended up with 6 regions across the globe, mostly centered around the Americas and Southeast Asia. And we selected these sites, these regions. We required them to have about 400 landslides on record. And we also required them to have some fire history as well, so we could then find burned landslides and unburned. And we used something called the Global Landslide Catalog, GLC. This is quite an interesting catalog. NASA put this together by doing some kind of like a web search of articles that describe landslides. So it tends to be biased towards English articles about newsworthy landslide events, and generally landslides that tend to be near urban areas. So it's not a perfect database. One of the big problems with this database is that it sometimes is not very accurate in the location of the landslides. Very often they report an accuracy that says the landslide occurred somewhere within a 1 kilometer radius, or a 10 kilometer radius, or a 50 kilometer radius. And so we ended up limiting that to 10 kilometers or finer. Some of the times we had a better accuracy than that. I apologize, a 15 kilometer or finer radius. And we ended up with 5,300 landslides that we could analyze, spread across these 6 regions that you see here. Okay, so how did we do this? So we took first fire information. We used a satellite called the MODIS satellite, and we used the burned area. Then we looked at the radius of where the landslide was said to occur, and the radius was the accuracy of that detection of that landslide. And then we summed up all the pixels that were burned, and we considered a landslide to be a post-fire landslide if there was some burned area in that radius for the past 3 years. And we chose 3 based on our review of the literature that might be impactful. For precipitation, we did the same thing. We ended up using this CHIRPS product, which is out of the University of California, Santa Barbara, Chris Funk and others. And we used the same radius of location, and we ended up computing 7-day running average percentiles. Because we had 40 years of data, we, instead of just saying like one day of precipitation. We compared that precipitation to the 40 other years and put it as a percentile. We did most of the analysis like this, but we ended up doing one more, slightly more complicated thing to actually convert the precipitation into a probability space, like a p-value, a statistical significance space. So to do that, and this is going to be the most complicated thing that I explain today, hopefully, and hopefully it isn't even that complicated for you guys, is we took the percentiles of precipitation for all of our landslide sites, our 5,300 sites. Then, for each site, we randomly selected a precipitation value from the same day of the year, but from a different year. And we had 38 years of record. Then we repeated this 100 times, so that we got samples of expected precipitation on that day of the year. And we did compared that 100 samples to the actual precipitation that preceded the landslide, and we ran a Wilcox test, and we computed a p-value that says the statistical significance of how different the precipitation was before the landslide compared to the other 38 years at that time of year. Okay, so we used both measures, the percentile first, and then we also did another set of analysis with the p-value. Okay, so what does this look like? So here's an example for California, okay, where we have, this is the day of the landslide here, and these are the number of days before the landslide. The blue boxes represent all the unburned sites, the percentile of the precipitation. The red bars represent the burned sites, the burned landslide sites. And this, what we see is that as we approach the date of the landslide, precipitation increases for both groups, burned and unburned. The shaded darker colors indicates that the difference between the burned and the unburned groups is statistically significant. And so this actually confirms our hypothesis that you need significantly more precipitation to cause a landslide at an unburned site than you do at a burned site. And this kind of confirms our hypothesis in California. When we look at some of the other regions, though, like this is the same plot but for the Himalaya region, you see no statistical significance. And sure, there is an increase leading up to the date of the landslide, but the two burned and unburned groups are not statistically different. And in fact, in this case, it looks like the burned group has slightly more precipitation, which was puzzling for us. And we believe that this is because of the relative low accuracy of the landslide detection, so that we were sort of contaminating our samples with burned areas that may not have been associated with the landslide. Okay, so then looking at other regions and looking at now the probability significance space, this is the p-value shown in the vertical axis. In the Southeast Asia domain, you see that unburned sites and burned sites both have an increase in precipitation leading up to the event, statistically significantly so, but that unburned sites require more precipitation to cause a landslide, or more significant precipitation. So that kind of confirms our hypothesis. In other regions like the Pacific Northwest of North America, you actually see that kind of strange. The burned sites only have a very small uptick in precipitation associated with the landslide. And so we think that this might be due to some kind of a sampling issue. Also, the seasonality is a little bit different. So that was a little bit surprising. The last type of plot I want to show is this seasonality plot, where what we have here, we organized all of our landslides to be aligned by the year of the landslide and the time before and the time after. So it turns out that, and I think this is in California, the rise in precipitation is happening earlier for unburned sites, which means the unburned sites have landslides that happen later into the wet season, as opposed to the burned sites are seeing landslides that happen sooner. And if we zoom in, it suggests that, and if we look at the seasonality altogether, that landslides occur earlier in the wet season for burned sites. As you can see, the red sort of shape here is shifted slightly. And so this again suggests that less precipitation, a shorter duration of the wet season is needed to trigger landslides for burned sites.
Is it for the same landslide type?
Yes. So we screened everything. That's a good question. We screened everything for these debris flow type landslides to try to make sure that we were comparing apples to apples. Yeah, good question. And so this is kind of a bit of a puzzling result for the intermountain west of the US, which tends to be drier. This is like where Utah is and western Colorado. And the two types of burned and unburned, red and blue, are very much, feel like they're out of phase. And it seems like the post-wildfire landslides occur in the middle of a relatively dry period, which we found to be summer. And our thought was that, if you look at this seasonally, that this spring and summer peak tends to be associated with these large storm events, like related to the monsoon of the actual North American monsoon, which is a much smaller version than the Indian monsoon. But we're not 100% sure if there's a clear driver for that. So, to summarize this topic, we showed that wildfire does have an impact on landslides in most of Western North America. We showed that less extreme precipitation events can trigger landslides at burned sites as opposed to unburned sites. Although there was a large number of uncertainties, especially in Central America and the Himalayas, which perhaps was due to our sampling issues and the uncertainty of that catalog requiring English-speaking articles and with location inaccuracies as big as 15 kilometers. Okay, so I'm going to shift to my last topic if we have time, and I'm happy to stop partway through. Maybe 10.
We started
10:45.
so around 10.
Okay. Oh, perfect. Yeah, and I'm happy to just wrap it up as we need. Okay, so this last topic, we're shifting from fire to ice. And so I couldn't help but put a reference to the Song of Ice and Fire there for those who know the Game of Thrones television show. So this is work that I published with my former postdoc back in 2020 in Nature and Climate Change. And this looks at how changes in future snowpack may affect our ability to anticipate drought. Okay, so what does this look like? Our hypothesis for this work was as follows. So in the Western United States, and I think probably also in parts of Europe, like close to the Alps, knowledge of spring snowpack, like on the 1st of April, for example, has been shown to be extremely useful in predicting water supply. This is because most of the water supply comes from snowmelt, and so that if you can observe the snow, you have a strong predictor of the stream flow. And so on the left here, this is kind of the historical climate that we hypothesize, where you have these observing stations in the mountains. They're called SNOWTEL is one of the networks, the most common networks, where you have these stations that are observing deep snowpack in the spring, and then even a simple linear regression between that snow and what runs off in the spring and summer is a very strong predictor of the annual water supply. So our hypothesis is that as the climate warms, so temperatures rise, you get less snow and more rain, that actually some of these observation stations may lose their snow completely. So that'll obviously make predictions that use snow more difficult. And what's more, I would say, is that it'll also change the flow paths, the length of the travel times for the snowmelt to reach the stream. It'll also affect the land-atmosphere interactions, more time for evaporation to occur. The atmosphere itself may have a higher evaporative demand and so on. So our hypothesis is that these forecasts will become less skillful. They will perform poorer, all other things equal, in a future climate. So what does this look like? Here's an example using observations. So on the left, this is data from a snow observing station called Snowtel near a place called Steamboat Springs in Colorado. A very nice place. And what I'm showing here is the 1st of April snow water equivalent. That's a measurement of the amount of water in the snow. That's more important than the depth of the snow, because as hydrologists, we really just care about how much water, when the snow melts, is going to end up in our streams and reservoirs. So they measure that by weighing the snowpack on something called a snow pillow. It's like a pillow filled with antifreeze, and it's on a scale. And so then the amount of snow is just weighed, and because the water is the thing that has weight. That's how you get that measurement. And it varies up and down over 30 years. Now the black line is the amount of flow in the river that's downstream of this observing site over the same time period. And this is the summer warm season flow, but it tends to be like a big majority of the total annual flow. And you can see that those two things vary quite closely together. And so what typically is done is people train a model, even a simple model, that just says the discharge is a linear function of the snow water equivalent, and you actually get a pretty good model. So we wanted to test this out, because then what you would do is in a future year, you would take your knowledge of snow and you would apply this model, and then you would get some forecast. Each year you would get a seasonal forecast. So we wanted to know what will happen to this relationship as we go out to the year 2100. And obviously we don't have observations yet of anything out to 2100, so this requires a model. So what we did was we took this hydrologic model called the variable infiltration model, and it was used climate change projections that were hydrologically downscaled, that we validated, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not going to show all of that, other than to say that the model simulates snowpack. It also simulates stream flow, and we use those simulations to train our statistical model on to see how that relationship is going to change. So really just hitting the high points here. If we do this over the western United States, the thing that we found is on the basis of snow, by the late century, so the period 2070 to 2099, 83% of areas see decreases in drought predictive skill relative to a 30-year historical period. So there's sort of a lot going on. I'll just kind of explain. The areas with the warmer colors, the tan and brown, are places where the skill is expected to decrease in the future, whereas the cooler purple colors are places where the skill may actually increase slightly. We used a threat score, equitable threat score, where our statistical model predicted drought based on April 1st snowpack, and the drought was considered a stream flow less than the 20th percentile. If that actually occurred, a drought did occur, that would be called a hit. But if you did not predict a drought with a statistical model, but one occurred, that would be considered a miss. And that is actually the majority. We made these bar plots in each of the 4 regions, the majority of our errors were due to these missed forecasts, which I would argue is some of the sort of the worst types of errors you could have from a planning perspective if your models are not predicting a drought, and then one occurs, that would leave your system quite vulnerable. So if we kind of show this based on the elevation of the different forecast points, and the skill is on the horizontal axis, where a better performing prediction is closer to the right, what we find is that actually higher elevation locations tended to see less change in drought prediction skill and even some of the increases. And so when we presented this to our stakeholders, water managers, our recommendation was them to sort of invest in higher elevation observations. And this is because higher elevations are expected to either see less warming, or they will remain cold enough, even despite future warming, that they can still have snow and still be useful predictors. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to skip ahead to my conclusions so that we end on time. Okay, so to summarize, I have presented, I guess, a lot of different topics, and I appreciate your attention. The first part was that intermittency of precipitation can act as a potential modulator of flood potential. The second main takeaway was that in most of Western North America and in other regions, it seems that you need less extreme precipitation to trigger a landslide if there has been a fire that occurred in that region in the past 3 years. There was a ton of uncertainty and a ton of noise in that relationship, which seemed to sort of overwhelm things, especially in the Himalayas. And then lastly, the seasonal water supply predictions. It seems that using higher elevation stations will be more resilient to climate change. And I didn't show a few other things, but that we recommend adding precipitation and soil moisture as predictors for some of these lower elevations. So I'd like to acknowledge the funding, and thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. Questions?
Thank you very much. It was very, very interesting. For the first part, I was wondering what are the sizes of the watersheds?
Yeah, so they range from about 50 to 5,000 square kilometers. But most of them are less than 1,000 square kilometers. So they tend to be, I guess, in the context of Israel, quite large. And so having just a single precipitation station like we have now is probably not enough to capture some of what's going on, which is maybe why we see the gridded and modeled analysis showing more of what we expect. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, this is important, and also related to changing in extremes. And flood, I think one of the first slides that you showed, that's not always more extreme rainfall produce more a higher flood.
Yes.
Yeah. So that's this is on the U.S. watersheds, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you know, this is when you say wet and dry, that means climatic, like in drier regions or in dry antecedent conditions.
It was the dry antecedent conditions. Yeah.
Because I wonder if you see difference in terms of climatic regimes.
Yeah.
Because here that we see that even if you have increasing intensity, sometimes reducing total rainfall or area will maybe can reduce the discharge because it's not enough. It depends on the watershed side and everything else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right. So that the peak magnitude may not describe the volume of like the area under the curve. Yeah, that's a really good point.
Yeah.
And something we wanted to look at but haven't really done yet.
Thank you. It was a very good talk. So a couple of questions. First, you said that if I understand correctly, regarding the effect of wildfire over landslide, wildfire condition the slope by increasing runoff. Have you considered the effect of loss of cohesion on the hill slope?
Yeah. So one of the problems we had trying to analyze so many landslides, which I was sort of alluding to, was that the accuracy of the exact location of the landslide was often missing. So we wanted to subset things by soil texture so we could get an estimate of cohesion. Separately, we were running like a slope stability model and stuff, which was not part of this analysis. I think clearly cohesion would be important, but we didn't look at it because of the location accuracy problem. We had an undergrad student, a brave undergrad student, use Google Earth to actually painstakingly find all the like 80 landslides. And we got more information there, but not for the whole analysis.
Okay, so that probably also answers the second question, that is, hill slope gradient is obviously the critical, or the most important precondition for landslide, which maybe can explain the noise in the Himalaya.
Yep.
Because, that would be something that I guess the same data set of this brave student can be useful to just look at the hill slope gradient and see if the slopes are already conditioned because they're steep.
Very steep.
It won't matter if there's big fire now.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense and should be relatively straightforward to do with a digital elevation model.
Right.
Yeah. Cool.
Thanks.
And regarding the linear model for the slope after discharge, so obviously it's probabilities that is statistically divided on a certain amount of the observation years. So how confident are we moving forward into the future performance of the model? And from my acquaintance of these type of model, what's its performance on extreme events or extreme drought events?
Yeah. So a couple of really good questions. So the physical model, this VIC model, simulates, it takes meteorological inputs and land cover and stuff, and it actually simulates the processes of the land surface. We tried to validate it with historical data, historical snow, historical stream flow. And I think it, like all models, tends to not capture the really extreme events so well, meaning the extremely low and the extremely high tend to be a little bit compressed. Although we were convinced that the model was fit for purpose based on, we had analyzed 2 historical 10-year periods and looked at the difference between those 2 periods in observed and modeled space and felt like it was capturing those sensitivities a little bit. Then with the model, the linear model, what we did was every 5 years we fit the model again and trained it on 5 years, and then 30 years training, 5 years application, and we kept doing that out into the future because we felt like that is what the water managers are doing. And then we ended up only talking about drought in a categorical sense. Yes, a drought, no, not a drought. And that helped a little bit to buffer some of the noise because there's a lot of stuff happening in the tails of the distributions. And so we were just saying, was it a drought? Was the flow less than the 20th percentile or not? And obviously that percentile changes as you go into the future. And so we had to work with that as well. It's a really good question. I don't know if I answered it. Yeah.